This public event is a culmination of a two-day conference which has been organised masterfully by Gareth Austin over there, Head of Research at King's College, and Caro, who's somewhere in the back, who've worked extremely hard to pull this all together with the very kind support of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and also the King's College as well. So we're absolutely delighted to be doing this, and it's been a really fascinating conversation over the last 2 years, last 2 days, not years, feels like years intellectually, but last 2 days from which I've learned an enormous amount. Primarily because it's one of the first serious initiatives to take an interdisciplinary approach to looking at Adam Smith within the Cambridge context, as far as I understand, bringing together both economists and historians, even a tame anthropologist like myself and others, to try and make sense of what, on the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith, we should be thinking about his legacy today. Now, as an anthropologist, I'm fascinated always by the cultural roots of words. Some of you may know that the roots of the word company. Does anyone know where the word company comes from? It's nothing to do with balance sheets. It comes from Old Italian con panio, meaning with bread, because the first companies were actually groups of people who ate together and then did commerce. Similarly, the word finance comes from the Old French finir, meaning to finish, because the first types of finance were conceived of ways of ending transactions, particularly blood debts, and using money as a means to an end, not an end in itself. Both of which are concepts which in many ways gel with what a lot of Adam Smith wrote about. But the one I really like is the roots of the word economics, which comes from the Greek oikonomia, meaning household management. Jane Austen wrote about good economics in her novels, not in the sense of someone being good with spreadsheets and algorithms, but managing households well. And anyone who's as old as me might have once studied home economics at school, which I used to think sounded really bizarre because it was all about cooking, but not when you actually remember the roots of the word oikonomia. And I mention all that because a key theme of what we've been discussing in the last 2 days is that although the City of London, Wall Street, business community, and groups like the Financial Times have tended to look at the Adam Smith legacy in the recent years through the prism of the wealth of nations and free market competition and everything that the invisible hand can drive in terms of innovation and progress and growth. The second half of Adam Smith's book, or the second book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is absolutely critical for making sense of what he said in The Wealth of Nations. And it's really part of this very rich context around Smith, which has gone ignored so often. So we're going to have 3 speakers, all of whom have touched on these themes before, looking at the wider context of Smith and what that does or does not mean in terms of how we should try and make sense of his legacy today, at a time when it's so vitally critical to be thinking about this, because economics, or oikonomia, is currently being contested in a very profound way politically on both sides of the Atlantic right now, and policy makers need all the ideas that they can get. So to do this, we have 3 absolutely fantastic speakers. Tim Beasley on my left, your right, who is a professor of economics and political science. He's keen to stress the second point. At the LSE, and has held many roles over the years, including he was previously on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee 20 years ago, I believe, when I was a junior economics reporter and terrified of people like him. So this is my revenge. Next to him is Matthew Agarwala, who is a double Bennett, as I say, because he's both at the Bennett School of Public Policy at Sussex University and also an emeritus at the Bennett School here in Cambridge. Peter Bennett's been very generous on many counts in that respect, and is going to be talking to us about sustainability. And at the end is Jane Hatch, who is a double... Jane Humphreys, sorry, it's been a long day. I'm going absolutely mad. Professor Humphreys, who is a double emeritus both at Oxford and the LSE. So 3 people to give us a fantastic perspective. Apologies again about your name. I'm hard to say. I've been juggling too much in the last day. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And so we're going to start off with Matthew, who's going to talk to us about his work. Each of them will present for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have a wider debate with the audience about some of the key themes that they have been touching on, and the bigger question of what is the real legacy of Adam Smith, how should we imagine him today, and what can he tell us about growth, economics, development, and above all else, happy and harmonious societies that actually work.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think I have to cover all of that in 15 minutes, I hope. It's a huge honor to be here, so thank you, Gareth. Thank you, King's College. And an absolute treat for me to be on such a distinguished panel. I feel a bit underqualified, but let's hope in the next 15 minutes I can give you something of interest anyway. I want to speak a little bit about what I think Adam Smith's work tells us about the world today and the world we're going to see in the future. So I've titled it The Current and Future Wealth of Nations. A bit of history. It's odd, I think, perhaps to start with the Peace of Westphalia, but in a document titled The Wealth of Nations, there are two things that really matter. One is wealth and the other is nations. The idea of a nation that you and I might recognize as a nation state, as far as I'm aware, and historians may correct me, really comes after the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, only about 130 years before Smith's work. Right? What that means is the context in which Smith is operating is one in which even the very idea of the nation state is still very much in its infancy. And so I think that shapes some of the work that he did at the time, and I think it shapes the way that we might want to interpret his work for today and into the future. Now, wealth is the other key component. I think of wealth in terms of capital assets, stocks that persist through time, that generate value year in and year out. I'm not great at defining it, what capital really is, but I think the pressure's off, because not only can I not do it, but the great capital theorist, the godfather of capital theory, Irving Fisher, never found in his lifetime an answer that he was satisfied with either. And so I think that question of what is capital is going to be one of the key themes that I'd like to bring about today. So since that time, the Peace of Westphalia, the birth of the modern nation state, Adam Smith's work on the wealth of nations, I've skipped over a few centuries here, but there's a load of economic history about what constitutes capital and how we use it and what role it plays in society for individuals, for businesses, for countries. But the entire context has changed dramatically. When Smith was writing to today, we see a huge transformation on three fronts: institutions, population, and nature. The world's largest economy, the United States, at the time that Smith was writing, was a colony. The world's largest democracy, India, was a company owned by this country. And the two largest countries in the world by population, India and China, each has a population today that's about double the global population that Smith experienced in his lifetime. So the institutions have changed, from companies and colonies to the modern nation state. The population has changed with severe consequences for nature, for the climate, for biodiversity, for the source of raw materials, for the livability of the planet into the future. And I think that's what I want to get through today. The population explosion, the expansion of human economic activity into previously wild spaces, has absolutely transformed life on this planet. In just the past half-century, inside the lifespan of people in this room today, we have seen a 73% decline in wildlife populations around the world. 3/4 of the animals that were alive and out there in nature when people in this room were born are now missing. I happened to take this photo in Rwanda a couple of years ago. One of the few species that is now back on track and growing, the mountain gorilla in Rwanda. In addition to the biodiversity loss, we have pumped 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, causing climate change, floods, droughts, natural disasters. And what this makes me think is that increasingly, the limitations on growth, the constraining factors that prevent further economic prosperity are no longer just issues of, do we have enough plows and tractors and buildings, not just physical capital, but it's also issues of natural capital. A livable planet, a stable climate system, healthy ecosystems, lively oceans with lots of fish, forests that purify the air, that recycle nutrients for us, that purify our water. These are the assets that we are running out of. Now, there is an economic model to help describe these assets and bring them in to economic thinking, economic modeling, and economic policy. And the way that this model should be described is developed by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, our Cambridge colleague. The way it should be described is with about 25 slides of calculus, or this one. And the way I like to describe it is, imagine you're running a bakery. The size of the pie that you can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in your pantry. Run out of ingredients, and tomorrow's pie will be smaller. Simple. What those 25 slides of calculus prove is that the economy operates on exactly the same basis as this simple bakery, except that the core ingredients of economic prosperity are not flour, sugar, butter. They are capital assets, broadly defined. Yes, physical infrastructure, this building, our airports, our roads, our ports, our factories and machines. Yes, physical capital. Human capital, absolutely, the health and skills of the population. Natural capital, those ecosystems, sources of raw materials, stable climate. These are economic assets. And combined, these assets make up what Partha Dasgupta calls inclusive wealth, our economic pantry. Natural, human, and physical capital. The size of the pie, that reflects our GDP, or if you're a company, your revenue. But it's what's going on in our economic pantry that is described by our data on inclusive wealth. And as any baker knows, you can always produce more pie today simply by raiding the pantry. But we also know that is patently unsustainable. And this is the path that we've been on. Now, if we look around the world at what's happening with our stocks of all of these assets, we actually have measurements. The World Bank, the United Nations, with some of the work that I've been doing with them, has been to help develop accounts for all of these sorts of different assets. And so what you can see globally is that wealth is rising, albeit unequally, but that the compilation, the constitution of that wealth is changing, the composition is changing. So produced capital, infrastructure, that's skyrocketing. Human capital is doing all right. But the only asset class that is in sustained, worldwide decline is natural capital. That's what we conclude from this. The only asset class, sustained, worldwide decline. Now, is that the right conclusion? The data says so. And I have a confession to make. For the past 15 years of my career, I've been doing this stuff and saying, yeah, that's the conclusion you make. Increasingly, I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong because our measures of inclusive wealth are not actually as inclusive as we might like. We have natural, physical, and human capital, sure, they're important. But we don't include social capital, the degree of trust we have between individuals, the trust we have in government, in businesses, the ability of communities to overcome collective action problems. We know that this is an economic asset. We know that it reduces transaction costs. If I trust you, I can engage in business with you with less legal fees, fewer legal fees. I don't have to inflate my prices because I'm worried whether you're going to give me the final payment. When I work with people I don't know, with governments I don't trust, I inflate my prices early on because I don't know if the final payment's ever going to come. Our social capital reduces transaction costs. It is an economic asset. The other is institutional capital. Quality of governance, stability of rule of law, efficacy of the courts, trustworthiness of the police. These institutions determine what we are able to achieve with all of the rest of the assets in our portfolio. And it strikes me that the assets these days that seem to be in the greatest freefall are not just natural capital, but the degree of trust, the social cohesion that we have, the rise of populism. This is a real economic challenge for us. The pace at which the institutions of American democracy have cannibalized themselves, the abandonment of the obligations of the independent houses of government, from the courts to the legislature to the executive branch. These institutions really do matter to the economic performance, not just of an individual country, but in an international world order, to the way that all countries can mobilize all of their assets. So I think these are now the binding constraints: institutional, social, and natural capital. Now, I promised you something looking forward. And I think the next big way that the world might change is with the AI revolution. And I think this has direct implications, both for wealth and capital, but also for nations as entities, as agents of the people. Now, the real person to speak about this is actually Professor Sir Tim Besley, whose work on political economy underpins all of my thinking here. There's been a lot of interest in how AI technologies might reshape the labor market. Am I going to lose my job? Are you going to lose yours? Who's gone sooner? Is it going to be white-collar workers? Is it going to be blue-collar workers? There's lots of research on this in the economic literature. But there's been no published work yet on how AI might affect tax systems, the ability of governments to generate revenue that we can then use to pay to invest in all of those other assets, in conserving nature, in delivering net zero climate compatible infrastructure, in supporting health and education, all of those other assets that we need. Now, it strikes me there's a fairly simple concern here. We tax labor at a relatively high rate. We tax capital, robots, algorithms, at a relatively low rate. If AI technologies like ChatGPT that produced this slide shift the new sources of value added away from labor in the future towards algorithms and capital and robots, away from high tax labor to low tax capital, then the tax base shifts with it. Right? If new value added is taxed at 20% instead of at 40%, we get less revenue. That means there's less money for public investment across the board in all of our other assets. Now, this is work that's under review at the moment at Science with my colleague, Professor Felix Kreutzig, who's my fellow Bennett Chair in Sussex. These are back-of-the-envelope calculations of what we've done here. So we've taken sort of OECD averages of the effective tax rate on capital. So that's like our corporate income tax, dividend tax, this sort of stuff. And OECD averages of the effective tax rate on labor. So our income tax, that kind of stuff, is about 35%. And if that's the case, then around a 10% shift of value added away from labor towards capital would lead to around a 2% reduction in tax revenue. Now, if you're sitting in the Treasury, that's something to think about. Right? If you're trying to figure out how do we deliver investments for net zero, How do we deliver support for the NHS? How do we improve our crumbling infrastructure? There's a challenge here. And I think the final point that I'm going to lead on, it's not just the tax revenues that matter for us to then redeploy in public infrastructure. It's also the ability of the state itself to govern large firms, big tech firms, and rapidly growing industries. These technologies enable a concentration of wealth within individual companies, even within individual people, that violates the basis of the nation state that we've had since that Peace of Westphalia, where there were lots of people, all of them had some degree of power to influence their governments. Now we have a very small number of people or corporations with extreme power to influence their governments. And it is incredibly difficult to tax those big corporations and those very, very wealthy individuals. So there is an erosion of the ability of governments to identify taxable events and to enforce tax legislation against them. So there's a huge political economy issue here as well. It's not just about tax revenue, public income, public expenditure. It's about the role of power in the state versus individuals and companies. And so I think the only ways we get through this, the ways we govern this, we basically have constant returns to scale governments, but we're facing increasing returns to scale industries. The only way we do that is with strong institutions. And so that means we've got to redouble our efforts to identify and measure and value and incorporate institutional capital into our economic models. And we must do the same thing with social capital. On that, that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And someone whose intellectual lodestar for many years was Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote about the many types of capital. I think that gives a really vital and very fresh twist on it and should provoke a lot more debate. So thank you. Professor Humphreys, Jane Humphreys. Now I've got your name right.
Okay, well, this book that we've been thinking about for the last 2 days in our little conference, The Wealth of Nations, I argue that Smith contemplates in that book two separate issues, two separate problems. The first is how markets were organised and how exchange happens with self-interested individuals, the use of money, and so on. And the second problem that he definitely thinks about is how society was provisioned from day to day and over generations. That is, I'm going to call that social reproduction, how social reproduction takes place. And he assigns to social reproduction very important role of mothers, women in the household. So it's women's unpaid care work in the home that Smith gives this pivotal role of social reproduction, of reproducing the labour force from day to day and intergenerationally. And this foundational work is actually missed out of economics. Smith himself loses track of it. He's much more interested in market exchange and the activities of the brewer and the butcher and the baker, driven by their own self-interest to exchange their commodities for money and then use that money to buy goods that they themselves would want. But this work is foundational, but it's overlooked in economic theory, in measurement, and in policy. And I think other economists moved even further away than Smith from considering it. These are essential activities in the home that are done without money being rewarded, and they underpin labour markets, they underpin public policy and public services, and their unequal distribution entrenches wider inequalities in the economy and society. And they're increasingly relevant in the case of demographic, technological, and environmental changes that I will bring up later. Now, care work in the home then consists of elder care, disability care, household maintenance, and emotional support. And it sustains human capabilities upon which all economic activities depend. So this is the foundation of economic life. And much of this labour is unpaid and, here's a crucial point, disproportionately done by women. The paradox then is care is foundational, but it's overlooked in theoretical economics, it's overlooked in measurement, and it's overlooked in policy. It's missing from gross domestic product that we hear our Chancellor talking so much about, and those who provide it are frequently described in labour statistics as economically inactive, and they're out of the labour force. It generates substantial value if we monetize it, as we would do the products produced in GDP. For example, if we look at globally, it's 9% of GDP if monetized. If we look just at OECD countries in 2021, it's massive 27% of GDP in monetary terms. Now, I'm going to argue that this omission has created persistent blind spots, and those blind spots mean that productivity is mismeasured, important contributions to well-being are omitted, and the costs of social reproduction are treated as private, as individualistic costs, rather than collective responsibilities. And structural inequalities across gender, class, and generations are obscured. So these blind spots really matter for empirical analysis and for the design of policy and for the evaluation of progress, whether measured in terms of economic performance, social equity, or overall social well-being. Now, feminist economists have long argued that this failure to include unpaid work in the home as value in our estimates of income or satisfaction. And they've demonstrated how households and communities provide essential labour that underpins labour markets and public services. My own work has tried to demonstrate how this division has very deep and long roots, and in fact, historically, women's unpaid work in the home played these crucial roles. These insights are increasingly relevant when we think, oh yes, the population, not just of this country, but right across Europe and many other countries in the global south, is ageing. So demographics mean that we'll need more elder care. At the same time, more and more women are going out to work in the paid labour market, cutting down the time that they have to work in the home. And technological change is shaping the supply of demand, the kinds of things that Matthew talked about. So we're seeing AI, for instance, structuring the supply of care in various ways. And there are international debates, too, about well-being and sustainability. And these highlight the limitations of relying on GDP as a measure of progress. I think our recent experiences with crisis, for example, the COVID crisis, clearly revealed the fragility of arrangements where care is provided unpaid in the household. So these missing care and caregivers, and this is widely discussed in two very recent, well, one publication, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which was a double special issue, which was published on Tuesday of this week, an absolutely fabulous compendium of very recent work on all the themes that I'm going to discuss today. And Jill Rubery and her co-editors' book on women in turbulent times is also a really interesting, it's not yet published, but it's in press, and it's a really interesting account of what she calls polycrises, how there's a number of overlapping crises afflicting economies and societies today. So early social scientists recognized domestic labour and care work as productive. I've already told you Adam Smith did, but he lost sight of this and the terrain of economics narrowed, unfortunately. By the 20th century, production and consumption organized through markets and motivated by self-interest were the primary concern of economic science. Tim might disagree with me here, but I do think economics undergraduates confront the first and second theorems of welfare economics rather as if that's a very important part of their education, if not the be-all and end-all. National income accounting systems reinforce this focus. They count as production anything that is within a monetary boundary. That boundary is determined by whether or not you could exchange that commodity for money. And this causes real problems when there's large amounts of subsistence production taking place in the global south or in Britain historically. So we have to confront that this production boundary may be distorting. It may be creating some of those blind spots that I've talked about. Phyllis Dean, who worked in the economics faculty here, who was in fact she was a research assistant working under the direction of Dick Stone, one of the pioneers of national income accounting. She was in Africa trying to construct national income accounts for African countries using a framework that Keynes and Dick Stone had developed, and she couldn't fit subsistence production, a lot of it done by women, into that framework. So that was the kind of challenge that you see when you're working with national income. Some of you may remember, I remember, so this is telling you my age, wages for housework, how this campaign then became political. Because women, in fact, recognized that the work they did in the home was work. It took energy, it took calories, it provided services. And they demanded wages for housework and access to social security, pensions, etc. So there's political implications here too. In 1993, there is a reform of the standard national accounts, the accounts that give us our relative GDP. And this allows for the inclusion of some subsistence production and, in fact, some other unpaid services that arrive in the household that are not monetized. From the very beginning, services we derive from houses are included in GDP. This is easy to do because you can monetize according to market equivalents. So it's very interesting that housework was left out when the services people got from their houses actually was included. And you can see some of the fallacy in this because the famous Cambridge economist Arthur Cecil Pigou pointed out that if you marry your housekeeper, national income falls. The services, of course, that this housekeeper is giving are then replicated by the housekeeper who is now Mrs. Pigou. And she may, in fact, be giving more services. We probably leave that to the side. But the point is that it's a theoretical anomaly here. The one argument that we can't possibly monetize domestic labor comes from the idea that we don't have any time use studies. We don't know how much time women spend in this. But in fact, there is quite a lot of work that has been done on time use recently. And in particular, in this Oxford Review of Economic Policy, we've seen there's articles by Jacques Charms and very nice pieces by a guy called Bridgman who works in statistics in the US. And they have summarized some of this work on time use. So we do have data on time use, in fact. So we can, in fact, start to think about monetizing work that's done in the home and including it in GDP. So what my future vision would be to reposition care in the next 25 to 100 years. And I would like to see some conceptual foundations to restore respect for care. Here, both direct care in terms of looking after people and indirect care in terms of housework. I would like to observe here also that to be carefree is a privilege. So I'm not just thinking about the carers here, but we have to think about the people who are cared for and who have no care responsibilities. The burdens and freedoms, of course, of care are not just gendered, but they're also racialized and linked ethnically. And care is relational and labour intensive, and so it can't be scaled up indefinitely, and it shows, therefore, the limitations of markets. There is a care gap. We know it. We read about it every day. We see it in our hospitals, beds in the corridors. People can't put their elderly and disabled and frail relatives into care homes because there are no places. But care generates externalities for society. Nancy Falbury has written extensively to demonstrate that healthier children become more productive adults, while supported elders make fewer care demands on the NHS, and communities benefit generally from caring activities. So the benefits of care are widely shared, and they cannot be appropriated by individuals. This means they are what economists call a public good, and we know that markets will systematically undersupply public goods. And Sue Himmelwhite is another economist working on this, and she's argued extensively that this is the case within the care economy. Care is also an investment, so this is going back, linking up to what Matthew was talking about too. Its benefits occur over a very long time span, and in fact, they're also diffuse. They escape individuals, and they're shared generally. So we need to be careful, however, not to simply think of supporting care for instrumentalist reasons. We can't simply think of care as boosting human capital and therefore raising productivity. Because care has also got an ethical dimension, and I'm sure in Adam Smith, in his other great book, Moral Sentiments, he actually talks a little bit about the ethics of care too. So what I would like to see then is making care visible and valued without reducing it to what is easily measured. But care is quite easily measured. And I think today the exclusion of care from national income and from the GDE and the satellite national accounts even is widely recognised, its exclusion is recognised as distorting. The question now then becomes how to measure it. I already said we now know a lot more about time use. So the papers in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy by Chalmers and Bridgman, they discuss how time use has changed over time. So cooking and cleaning have been reduced, but childcare has actually increased. And although work unpaid in the home is now more equally shared between men and women, women still do massively more than men. I mean, several times more. So, and men tend to take over what we might think of as the nice bits of care. So they look after the children, but they don't clean the bathroom. That's the kind of way in which the care in the home is changing. But I want to point out that all current imputation strategies, that is valuing care according to market equivalents, so either opportunity costs of the labour that provides care or the replacement cost, you hire a housekeeper, you value your wife that way, as Pigou maybe did, or you can sell the goods, you buy the goods directly on the market, so you buy care services directly on the market. All of these risk hugely undervaluing care, and that's because the market itself conveys the unpaid care work done in the home to reduce status for care workers in the market. So in the study that my colleague Lou Henderson and I contributed to that OxRep special issue, we looked at breastfeeding, and we showed how, in fact, breastfeeding historically develops, but formula, this is a paradox even more astonishing than Pigou's, because if a woman stops breastfeeding but buys formula from the market, GDP rises. And that's, of course, when a very inferior substitute is being used. So we in fact use this paradoxical account to show breastfeeding is a labour-intensive activity, but it's got huge positive externalities. I'm not going to go on too long into the next few topics, but we can talk about how we can insert the care economy into macroeconomic accounts. Macroeconomic analysis is incomplete without accounting for unpaid care. We might think of how austerity, for example, has forced families to substitute unpaid care in the home for withdrawn social services, and who bears the burden of that rise in unpaid care in the home. Reduced public spending on health and education forced families to substitute unpaid care again. So I think reframing care as social infrastructure means that we can treat public investment in care analogously to physical capital. It is looking forward, and its benefits accrue over time, and as I have said, they are also very diffuse. Care also has employment implications. The care burden that many women face is carried by them into the labour market, and it adversely affects both the jobs they can take, the recognition of their commitment to work, and their access to long periods of employment and therefore pensions and social security. This is part of the work that Claudia Goldin got the Nobel Prize for. In her book on career and family, she has lots of very good evidence on how, in fact, unpaid care in the home bleeds into women's treatment in the labour market. And we might want to think how we could offset this. There might be instrumentalist ways. You know, people are very keen on family-friendly policies. That's simply to get more married women into the labour force. And similarly with conservative inputs, there we might think of pronatalist authorities, pronatalist governments advocating cash for care. So that would then mean that women would stay in the home, and perhaps we might, if reform form a government, we might actually see some of this cash for care policy. But again, let me emphasise that undervaluation of paid care is likely to come out of all of these imputation strategies for the reason that I've suggested. There are global pressures on care, ageing populations, austerity policies, rising female participation rates, and these have reshaped global care economy. OECD models project that public spending on long-term care, this is care for the elderly, could double from 1.5% of GDP in 2010 to 3% or more by 2050. And recently that's been scaled up even more. And these gaps in provision are in fact absorbed by women and families. Hitherto, we've made significant reliance on migrant workers, on global care chains. So we actually free ride on global south governments into their training programs. We recruit nurses from the Philippines, plug them into our NHS hospitals and so on. But this redistributes responsibilities and inequalities across gender, class and borders. Digital technologies are also reframing care. Yeah, almost finished. So we see there is a danger that in fact we will in fact measure what we can we will in fact value what's easily measurable through these digital care economies. So yeah, let me conclude. I want to see care recognised as public investment, and I think it should be recognised as foundational. Conceptual debates have established how gender norms and social expectations shape who performs care and generates disadvantages and privileges. I think the care economy highlights the systemic limits of markets, And private provision, I think, cannot secure adequate, equitable, or affordable care. And empirical studies confirm these highlights. All those publications I showed you, they actually contain massive amount of empirical evidence to confirm this. So, in the next 250 years, or even the next 25, I would like to see economists, policymakers, and governments needing to go back to Adam Smith's original conceptualization of the economy, as including the provision of those necessaries and conveniences of life that were produced within households. Adam Smith lived with his mother, who managed and looked after his household while he was writing The Wealth of Nations. Care is not a private responsibility, but a public concern with wide macroeconomic implications. And I'm calling for improved measurement, theoretical and empirical attention, and above all, institutional reforms that ensure that care is recognised, supported, and shared more equally.
Well, thank you very much, and I think that's a call and a campaign that we can almost all of us get behind very enthusiastically, not least because it gives a whole new twist to the concept of home economics or economia. So thank you for a really provocative paper that complements Matthew's paper very well. So now over to Tim.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me. I'm going to talk about some quite big picture issues. I'm calling the presentation Economic Principles for a New Consensus. But let me begin with the sort of grisly bit in a way. That I think we stand, I think, by wide acknowledgement at a point of inflection where many of the rules by which we think we've been governing ourselves, our economies, are in question. And I love this this quote from Gramsci: "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And I'll leave it up to you who you think belongs in that category. We are in a world in turmoil in many ways. Conflicts, the rise of populism, climate change, these have all been raised, the corruption of democratic norms. And I think one that hasn't been mentioned, though, is the very serious position of Europe in relation to this. If you read the Draghi report, Europe is now almost entirely dependent on a combination of US and Chinese technology to a point where we can do very, very little without being able to draw on that technology. For example, we can't defend ourselves without using US technology. So where are the answers in social science? I mean, that's why we're here in a way. We want to talk about the contribution that social science can make to these challenges. And you could say in the past it's been major social scientists like Smith, Marx, Keynes and Hayek who have shaped these great societal debates and influenced them. And you will have your view about which of them, their ideas are more have influenced you more. But the point is social science has always been at the heart of these debates, and it should be at the heart of them now, even at this very difficult point. This famous quote from Keynes, though, stresses that it's not always the contemporary or the new ideas that really matter. And it could be ideas that have been around a long time but have been unnoticed. And this was particularly notable if you look at the history of what's now called neoliberalism. Those ideas were not new when Thatcher and Reagan took them up. They've been sitting around for as long as, well, certainly since 1938, when there was a famous meeting where the term neoliberalism was derived, and then people like Friedman and Hayek and others kept those ideas current until such a point as they were implemented. And that fits very well the idea that madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. When you think about, there's a kind of indictment that's going on of what's called neoliberalism, the idea that a lot of all the problems we just talked about are rooted in that. I think that's a simplistic view, but for sure many of the things that we care about have roots in consequences of globalization, many of which we benefit from. If you're living in a low-income country today, there were huge benefits from being able to integrate into the global economy. But we also know that in advanced economies, it's created a lot of frictions, particularly in industries that have been subject to international competition. So those ideas have both been powerful and beneficial in some contexts. But of course, as has already been mentioned, we're on the cusp probably of a new set of not threats, I think opportunities and threats around technological change, including AI and its implications. So what economic ideas are available? And I'm going to tell you where we tried to source that in a moment. The good news on that is that maybe we're being in a moment of crisis. The more we convince ourselves we're in a moment of crisis, maybe the more we'll have appetite for change. And this is a quote from Milton Friedman about how he became influential. The thing you have to remember about Milton Friedman, by the way, for those who don't know, is he really was out there. He was on TV. He was on, how many of our equivalent social sciences are appearing on every evening on the TV trying to convince people of the correctness of their views. But he knew for a long time he was not being influential. And he says only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depending on the ideas lying around, that I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives, to keep them alive and make them available until the politically impossible become the politically inevitable. And I think that's what we as social scientists should be doing, creating the ideas and making sure they're available. So when the moment comes for those ideas to be needed and implemented. Just to bring it back to Adam Smith for a minute, I used this quote in a presentation earlier. Clearly, Milton Friedman's take on Adam Smith, very misleadingly, was that Adam Smith was supporting his agenda. That he quotes him approvingly as saying, it was, Adam Smith influenced me to come to this neoliberal view. There are two kind of policy paradigms that are talked about, though, if you look at the sort of intellectual history here. Some people call one the post-war consensus. Of course, there's almost there'll be nobody here almost with living memory of the Second World War, but there was no question or doubt that the psychological impact on society of coming out of what was a really major event led to huge societal changes, both attitudinal and institutional, that led, and also the experience of wartime management meant that there was much more government presence and acceptance of government presence in different parts of the economy, in the social sectors, Keynesian macroeconomic policy. All of these things became cemented in what is often called the post-war consensus. The kind of conventional view is that after the 1970s, the crises that took place there, the rise of Thatcher and Reagan brought a new form of consensus, now often called the neoliberal consensus. And the interesting thing was how much of that consensus persisted beyond Thatcher and Reagan. Indeed, Thatcher was once asked, what was your greatest political achievement? And her answer was Tony Blair. In other words, it was not a policy that disappeared once these protagonists left the stage. They were very much perpetuated with Clinton, Blair, Obama, Cameron, you name it. I just put this little, I don't know why I put this up on the right-hand panel of what the Adam Smith Institute's view is of Adam Smith, that our mission is to use free markets to create a richer, freer, better Britain. So that neoliberal view still pertains. Smith wasn't a neoliberal in my view, and I made this point earlier. His vision was of a commercial society where trust and virtue were central to the operation of the market system. And I take it that many of the things that I think Jane was arguing about, or arguing for, are about a notion of a better form of a potential market society, but more and beyond, of course, you wouldn't stop there. But our discipline stripped many of these ideas away, and the question is how many of them we can bring back. So the question is, what would a policy paradigm for the future look like? And I don't know the answer to that, sadly, but I think I've got some pointers to offer to you. And I think it will help in restoring what I view as the Smiths Project, to understand how institutions could serve the public interest and strengthen moral sentiments in the process. We need a vision that also is fit for the contemporary challenges we face, works in globalized markets, and in particular safeguards democratic freedoms, because the other thing, we know that the economic situation in the time of Smith was different, but it was also before an era of mass democracy. So what did we do? We do what all academics do when they want to make progress. We had a conference. And we convened a group of, I think, 75 different economists at the LSE, and we produced this book. This book, by the way, is freely available. It's open access. We do have hard copies. In fact, I keep my hard copies in a document box that used to belong to John Maynard Keynes to connect it back to Cambridge. It fell into my possession, and it now is a proud receptacle in which I keep copies of the London Consensus book. Many of these people you'll know, they broadly were connected to the LSE. Danny Roderick, for example, is one of our authors. And we asked them the following question. If you look at the state of economics today, and in the field in which you're expert, can you tell us what you think is the best consensus view supported by the evidence and the arguments in the sphere in which you work? And you can read their thoughts. That so far, very positive reactions to the book. But the question is, we said, let's step back and think about what conclusions can we, or what broad ways of thinking are there that could be the basis for a new consensus, and what could make the centre of gravity of a new way of thinking that could be useful, could be that equivalent of the thing that's lying around when the moment is right. The one thing that we were very clear about, and I'm not going to go into this in detail because I want to be brief, but of course the way the so-called neoliberal consensus perpetuated itself was via something that's called the Washington Consensus. It was a set of principles that were taken up by the IMF and the World Bank and used extensively in their policy dialogues with various countries. And there were many criticisms of that, but one of the criticisms was the notion there was a kind of one-size-fits-all remedy that could be deployed wherever those organizations were engaging. One thing we say is policy making is highly contextual. It's contextual at the moment in history in which it's being developed, the culture and the nature of the political system, all of those things are contextual. So what we're not trying to come up, and we don't try to come up with a set of policies that are going to be universally acceptable. What we're going to try and come up with is a set of principles that we think then can be deployed in the process of policy making. And the other thing I'll emphasize is this is about a political economy consensus, not an economic consensus, because we think the conjoining of ideas in economics and politics is got to be central to all of this. Of course, whether a consensus is valuable at all is debatable. This is a quote from Maggie Thatcher. What great cause would ever have been fought and won under the banner, I stand for consensus. But anyway, let's try and at least make the case. So, as I said, we're not trying to come up with a policy consensus. And what do we think the purpose of this is? To galvanize collective action. At the end of the day, if we want to change the world for the better, we have to get together and have some set of principles to guide that journey. So here's the principles. I'm not going to go through them all at any length, you'll be relieved to know, but I will just briefly explain some of the thinking behind all of them. And then I'll go into one in a little more detail, and actually it will connect a little bit, not fully, with Jane's presentation. So we think when we stepped back and we read all of these chapters that have been written, we try to say, what are the messages coming out, the cross-cutting messages that are shaping the thinking across all of these authors? And one thing that's very clear, that we cannot any longer be measuring economic progress in terms of money. That there are many things, and this is the principle I'll go to it a little more, that many of the things that are causing angst in the world could not be resolved by trying to redistribute money to people. Indeed, many people get upset when they think that you're trying to buy them off for some loss that they've incurred. It can be very undignified to feel you've been harmed and the only thing we can offer you for your harm is some money. But economists act as if money can be the currency that resolves everything. And it's very clear that if you look at debates about trade or technology and the dislocations that have been created through those things, the adequacy of viewing monetary compensation as the way to deal with is too limited. Now, well-being matters, but I don't necessarily well-being, I'll come to it in a minute, I don't think it's just national happiness accounts or anything. So that one I'll come back to in a minute. The others, let me go through very quickly, and then I'll come back, as I say. Growth still matters. This is important, and even in the context of what Matthew was saying, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the growth agenda. And my colleague Nick Stern has a recent book that points out that addressing the climate challenge is not inconsistent with generating growth. The belief that the only way to resolve that is to give up on growth, he views as a seriously mistaken view, and both from a point of view of international development, but even from the position of developed countries. Growth still matters for more than just economic reasons. One of the reasons our politics is being corroded is that low growth turns us into a kind of zero-sum politics. The only way we can give something to somebody is to take something from someone else. You cannot, the advantage of growth is the proceeds of growth give you some flexibility in how you can reward different groups. Place matters enormously. That a lot of times economists' view is, let's just produce something in the most efficient location. It doesn't matter where it's produced. What matters is that it is produced and that someone gets to consume it. But I think we've learned that place is enormously important in considering the structure of production. Resilience is important, and the role of government in ensuring resilience, of course, the COVID pandemic was a huge example of that, but it goes beyond that. And it's not just macroeconomic resilience, it's giving people the reassurance that if they face some bad outcome in their life, they can be protected against that, both for the sake of psychology and material consequences. So those are the first three. The fourth is there's no good economics without good politics. And as Gillian pointed out, I am professor of economics and political science, so I'm allowed to say this, because very often economists are enormously snooty about politics. And the story goes roughly the following way. Economists have everything right. We know the right policies. And if only those silly politicians would get out of the way, the world would be a better place because we would be able to get the policies that we think are right in place. And that politics is kind of some grand distortion on the pursuit of nirvana. I wholly reject that view. Things only ever happen because of politics. You go back and you think, when was the world ever run by benevolent dictators? Unfortunately, you'll struggle to find them in history for very good reasons. You've got to get your politics right, and politics and economics have to work together. And many of the problems we face is that we are not conjoining good economics and good politics in the way we're presenting policy making. Our politicians have become, for example, very dishonest about some of the trade-offs that are faced and think that they can sweep those under the rug. You have to be honest and upfront about the consequences of the choices that we make and treat people like adults. So good economics and good politics go together. And then the fifth principle is the importance of a capable state. If you look at the history of the 20th century, there was just a remarkable transformation in the capacity of the state to deliver for its citizens. But many of the challenges that we face now, and I think Matthew nicely illustrated that in the context of taxation, are going to require rebuilding and reconsidering the capacity of the state to deliver in ways that we were taking for granted. Some of them will be good. I mean, one area actually I'm super optimistic about AI, and it's not getting much coverage in the media, is on healthcare. It's going to be utterly transformative in looking after people using AI to analyze. We individualize treatments using the protein folding, the guys who won the Nobel Prize. That's going to lead to all kinds of unimaginable individualized forms of treatment for disease because AI can do that. So, but AI will also have consequences for the design of tax systems, for other ways in which we interact with each other and with the state. And so we really do need to start rethinking which aspects of state capacity need to be modified. So I'll just very briefly come back to, it's not just about the money, and connect it back to Adam Smith, and particularly some of the important ideas in Smith about that come up in the theory of moral sentiments. That Smith understood that running a successful economy is not just about giving people resources, material resources. A sense of belonging to a community, dignity, self-respect were all things that are very central to Smith's conception of what a good economy and what a good society would be. And that's going well beyond the narrow pursuit of material well-being as the objectives of government policy. And that's particularly important as we try to manage structural transformations that are going to take place. We cannot lean against wholly what's going to happen with AI, but we can manage it well or badly. I mean, a good example is what happened when, quite rightly, and I know this sounds a controversy, we decided to close our mines in the UK. I come from a mining family. My grandfather worked in the mines of South Yorkshire. It was a huge dislocation for people from who were working in the mining industry. But from an economic point of view, now, of course, there's an additional argument based on carbon, but that wasn't even around then, when you could buy Polish coal for a third of the price of making British coal. What was the problem? It was the way it was done, the way communities suffered, many still suffering from that dislocation. We've got to learn better how we manage economic transformation, and we've got to learn from the lessons of the past, but not say that the only way to do it is we should never make those tough decisions that make economic sense. One thing we do know, though, is that economics and measures of well-being do line up pretty well. And I do get upset when people say, actually, economics doesn't matter for well-being. Economics matters enormously for well-being. There used to be a belief in something called the Easterlin paradox, but it's disappeared from the data. Now the data have got better. That somehow you didn't get improvements in living standards when you got to a certain level of income per capita. That's just not in the data anymore. And poor old Easterlin, who had his name on that, I mean, the poor fellow is no longer with us, but you know, it's just not, the Easterlin paradox is not a paradox anymore. Now we have much better data. But the point is there is an incredibly strong link, both at the individual level and the country level, that levels, however you choose to measure subjective well-being, at least it goes with that. I think the other thing we have to do, and I love this because it's partly my colleague Richard Laird, who's a wonderful fellow, age 92, he still comes to his office every day in the morning and then goes to the House of Lords in the afternoon and is engaged in debates. He formed an organization with the Dalai Lama called the Action for Happiness, which gives you, and you can sign the pledge. If you want to be happier, go sign the pledge tonight. You'll be happier tomorrow. And they are trying to explain to people what is it that, you know, maybe we all know what makes us happy, but actually I'm not sure I know what makes me happy, and I'm helpful to know it's giving, relating, exercising. We need to start reflecting as a society on the things that matter to us, and I think what James was talking about just now is exactly central to that. And my last slide. So I think that I'm not really here to apologise for economics, whether it be the economics of Smith or anybody else for that matter. But I do think that the economics is helping, and this came really out of our London Consensus project, to understand complex problems, and does provide some interesting principles that we extracted from what we view as the current state of our discipline. And it's not, you know, we are not about making the case for free markets or not making the case for free markets. We need to begin with principles about the things we care about. And I'll just make the final comment that this is a project in political economy. It's not an economics project and it's not a political science project. If we don't get better at understanding the interplay between economics, politics, and social forces, we will not be able to tackle these. And that's really the central challenge, I think, that we all face if we're going to have the kind of change that many of us are hoping will occur. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. And listening to the three of you, I take away sort of three key points. One is that the work of Adam Smith is as vital as it has ever been, but has been often misunderstood in recent years quite significantly. Secondly, that to really appreciate Adam Smith in terms of his entire body of work, we need to very urgently put the economics, the market-based analysis, into a social and political and environmental context that takes a wider view of what it means to have an economy, or economia in the Greek sense, and what capital means in a much wider sense. And three, I'm very struck by that Milton Friedman quote that you really only start to get significant changes in the intellectual infrastructure in response to a crisis. So on that basis, we are due for a big change. And we can all contribute to that. So let's have some questions or comments or discussions from the audience. Since we've only got about 50 minutes, I'd appreciate them being fairly short, not long statements, and it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself briefly. And if you want one of the panel in particular to address this, please indicate which one. So, open to anyone. Over to you.
Test.
Thanks very much to all of you for such interesting, stimulating presentations. And thank you particularly to Matthew for raising the issue of tax and taxation, which has been a taboo in politics for the last 30 years, or more even. Tim said we need a capable state, and Jane says we need care to be centred more. So I think, we need to, part of this discussion about economics is to get mature and adult about tax instead of being scared to talk about it. And I think it might be an idea to think of giving it a new name.
Any suggestions?
Well, that can be I've got an idea, but I'd like to see you three what your name
Okay,
is.
this can be your next holiday word game with the family. Come up with a word for tax that's not a 4-letter word. Okay. Well, while you're thinking, let's get another. We've got a question up here. This is Patricia, who's the archivist of King's, and if you've not been to King's and don't know about the archives, we have a wonderful collection of Keynes's scribbles over the years, which are very revealing, very haunting, not to mention those from Alan Turing and E.M. Forster and others. So anyway, Patricia.
And Arthur C. Pigou. 100 years ago, Frank Ramsey developed a model for including the effect on future generations of decisions being made. Is anybody doing any research on that sort of thinking?
So how do we think about intergenerational transfers and both assets and obligations, which is a really critical question. Should we take one more while everyone's thinking? We've got a question up here, and then we'll take the second round of those over there. So question, okay, back there, and then we'll come back to you two in a moment.
Thank you. David Ormrod, University of Kent. We really should start, of course, with the theory of moral sentiments before we get to the wealth of nations, really. And insofar as we're taking that as our starting point, and people did talk a bit about ethical choices and so on, this is all about benevolence and humanitarian concern, isn't it? And that connects, obviously, with development issues and debt justice. Now, I think it's very important to relate this to action within civil society, not just nation states, the nation, which is what we've been rather obsessed with these last 2 days, but indeed with civil society and communities too. And in terms of civil society, what do we mean? Well, I mean voluntary bodies, I mean universities, I mean the churches, actually, which we often forget about. And I simply wanted to draw attention to one quite extraordinary report. It surprised me when it landed on my desk not very long ago. This is the report of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, commissioned by Pope Francis, and indeed the chairman, and the Vatican actually got into collaboration with the, let me get the title right, the IPD, the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, which is located at Columbia in New York. Right. And the chairman of this whole thing, 30 people, top economists, they're not necessarily Catholics, I doubt that very many of them are, is none other than Joe Stiglitz, and our friend Adam Tooze. All these names are really very familiar, right. And I would urge people to look at that. And so I'm talking about civil society, not right. about the nation. I'm talking about the theory of moral sentiments and humanitarian concern.
Well, thank you. Well, if you're sitting in King's, it's rather hard to ignore the church, because you have a whacking great chapel on your doorstep every day. But I take your point entirely about civil society. I ought to say, by the way, that both Adam Tooze and Joe Stiglitz will be coming up to King's in the next couple of months. So we're going to be organising events around them. So do, keep your eye out for that. But so we have a question about, let's not just focus on the wealth of nations and the nation state, but what about civil society? Secondly, brainstorm. Secondly, what can we call tax that makes it more exciting and acceptable? And thirdly, what about intergenerational transfers? Jane, you look like you want to take the intergenerational transfer one, or?
Well, on the tax issue, I mean, the level of inequality today is just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, you get these statistics like the top 18 billionaires own more wealth than half the world's population. But I think, as Matthew pointed out, it's extremely difficult to tax billionaires, whereas it's actually easier to tax millionaires. This was the kind of problem that Biden came across, because his program depended on raising taxes. And it was difficulties accumulated because the millionaires had supported Biden's election. So if you can't tax the super rich, and we have to think how to tax the super rich, then in fact, I think the tax issue is really problematical. And this is of course tied in with globalization and the need to have more international agreements about tax. I agree with you, Simon, that it would be good to think of a new name. And people do seem to be more willing to stump up for certain kinds of expenditures. So you could call these things contributions, or something like that. I don't know, people can maybe answer the question. Do you feel better when you get a little kind of thing from a local authority telling you what your rates have been spent on? Does that make you feel better or worse when you see how you've been spent?
We could also call it tithe or zakat. Matthew.
I'm terrible at titles and naming things. So I'm probably the worst person to answer that particular question of what should we call tax instead of tax. I think picking up on your point about taxing billionaires, yes, all for it, but devilishly difficult to do in practice. But we should also not shy away from some of the sort of observable empirical facts about taxation in the UK. Since the Second World War, the only segment of the socioeconomic spectrum that pays less tax now than at any point since the Second World War, it's not the billionaires, it's the middle 50%. It's from the 25th to the 75th percentile of income. Right? That's the only group that pays less tax now than at any other point since the Second World War in this country. This country's tax system has become really quite increasingly progressive. Whether it's progressive enough or not, that is a question of political economy, and as an economist, I'm not qualified to answer. But that fact is often overlooked. And when we concentrate the tax base on too small a slice of society, just a small number of big firms, a small number of very wealthy people, we really put our public revenues at risk, because those firms can move, those people can move. It's really, really tricky. So the thing that I try to push back to politicians these days is, if the British people don't think this country is worth paying for and aren't going to pay their taxes for it, then who else would invest and who else would stump up? Why would anybody else do it? Right? So we have to have that honest discussion. And I think this is part of what you were alluding to about the poor quality of public debate. The politicians and the people hold each other in mutually low esteem, and so we can never have a decent discussion about tax in this country.
Well, the only thing is they both hold journalists in even lower esteem. So
Big mistake in this country. On debt justice, or should I?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
On debt justice, there's at least 2 billion people in the world now who live in countries where the government spends more on servicing the interest on their national debt than they spend on education or on healthcare. Right? That's a tough spot to be in. Right? On the other hand, perhaps I should leave Tim to speak about this. There's a huge variation in the way that we collect tax across countries. Poor countries don't tax. So that's a big issue. They've got to collect the tax, they've got to develop the tax capacity to do that. And on intergenerational justice, or intergenerational transfers of wealth, I'm a climate economist. That's all we really talk about, right? Climate change is the ultimate intergenerational transfer of wealth. Right? We are transferring wealth from our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to ourselves today. Right? We are imposing the costs on them of the climate that we are degrading and the ecosystems that we are depleting.
Another reason to think about the word capital. Tim?
Let me just I don't have a lot to say on intergeneration, but there's a famous story, which I'd love to know whether it's true, about Keynes and Ramsay at dinner. I assume it was in Keynes, where Ramsay was explaining his ideas. And we call it in economics, we often call this the Keynes-Ramsay rule, because although Ramsay wrote the paper, Keynes did some subsequent work. So, and yeah, that's very much still part of the research program that goes on in economics. And it's a new twist, because one of the questions is, we can think about how individuals make intertemporal decisions, but as my colleague Nick Stern pointed out, for the sake of making intergenerational justice, if we use the discount rates that people use in everyday decision making, we would basically not care about the planet at all, because people need quite high rates of interest to be persuaded to save. So he proposed, and it was possibly the most controversial thing in the Stern report in 2001, that we use a very, very low discount rate to discount for the well-being of future generations. And that was the biggest pushback, I think, of all the recommendations in the Stern Review, was his discounting. But it all stems from the famous work by Keynes and Ramsay. On civil society, I think that, I don't want to go into this length, the whole question of the relationship between also the civil society and the state, and whether that relationship is got to evolve. One view, it's a simplistic view, was we kind of used the state to substitute for civil society organisations because of some of their inefficiencies in the scope of the coverage of people who get access to them. But I think one of the resurgent debates will indeed be about the future role for civil society, maybe particularly when we have cash-strapped states. But on the tax point, I mean, I make a couple of points. One is, for reasons I still, and I say this, I was in Brussels two weeks ago, and I made exactly that point I make every time. Why does the EU allow two major tax havens to operate within the EU? You know, we can be sanctimonious about taxation, but even within the EU, they have two tax havens, and they will do absolutely nothing about it. So the idea you could ever resolve this without serious international cooperation is a major issue. But let's look at the history. I'm going to host you on your own petard to some extent, Simon, because the history, if you read Margaret Levy's book of Rule and Revenue, which is one of my favourite books on the history of taxation, she points out that the story is a story of reciprocity, that effectively the state has to deliver for people to be willing to pay tax. And of course, we do have a name for taxes that are not taxes. We call it national insurance. And that was created. There was a huge ruction at the time, as you know. There was all the budget was voted down in 1911, all the rest of it. But eventually it was accepted. But that was a reciprocal tax system, one where there were clearly defined benefits for the payment of taxes. But I think we now operate on a system that's not narrow reciprocity of that kind. You get X for Y. Although I think we should go back to a more serious reciprocal system to try and rebuild that social contract, if you like, between the state and the citizen. But more generally, we have to be clearer that you get from the state. And John, my now dearly departed colleague, John Hills, wrote this wonderful book called The Myth of Them and Us, pointing out that over the life cycle, the taxes we pay, we often get back at a later point in the life cycle. And narrowly view it as a point in time. It's just very misleading. And I think that book still merits rereading, because it was a really insightful book about the nature of the relationship between taxes and spending over the life cycle.
I'll say that one of the few places I know where that idea of reciprocity in taxation really works is Switzerland at the cantonal level, where there is a sense of accountability. The other thing I'll say is, in relation to Frank Ramsay, one of the fascinating wrinkles about Frank Ramsay, of course, who was at King's, you may know, is that the reason he died so young was that he went swimming in the Cam and got a virus before they had antibiotics, and so he died from that. So someone who's a keen swimmer, I think of that whenever I go into the Cam in the summer. But anyway, so we have questions. Got a question up there, the lady up there, and then Gareth wants to ask a question, and I think we had someone over here as well. Comment, okay, and over there. So we got.
They call the freedom contribution as a tax, which is not really called a tax. It has been coined in the last election.
Freedom contribution, okay, that's not a snappy word, but it captures the idea very well. But that's a very interesting down payment on freedom, or freedom down payment, or interesting idea. We can have comments on that later on. We can collect a whole bunch of comments. Maybe we can create a prize. Whoever gets the best name will get a bottle of King's wine from the cellar. Up there.
Great day, Dr. Alicia Lola Jones, faculty here at Cambridge. Thank you so much for this panel and for this convening that we've experienced these last 2 days. I'll tell you, as I entered in, I was thinking of the penultimate panel from yesterday and the research that our colleague in history gave with regard to Latin America. And I was thinking of, the financialization and the stocks and how human cargo figured into that, and how might we introduce this founding foreparent in economics to new readers. And so I'm wondering, in a two-pronged sort of question, really along the lines of cultural anthropology, as a person who teaches IP on the global marketplace, I'm wondering about culture as it figures into these ideas of financialization and the role of human beings within how we understand Smith going forward the next 25 years. But then also, I'm thinking of the experience of engaging the text for new readers who may experience the tensions in the text that some of you all have already pointed to. I'm thinking of specifically a strategy that feted cultural theorist Bruno Nettel undertook as he read himself, where he revisited the experience of his text by those who were described as primitive, savage, even the sort of shortcomings around describing the African within this text. What is the culture of reading that is addressed in the text, as well as culture as a commodity the next 25 years?
Okay, that's a big question, fascinating question. Let's take two more questions. Let's group them together with three, and then we'll have the chance for the panel to think of their answers. I know Gareth wants to ask a question. You made a comment. Yeah, that's it. Okay, and I think we had over there. Okay, so one, Gareth, and then.
I think Gareth is going to.
You can
quick
fight about precedence and seniority between the two of you, or not.
A quick question for each of the three speakers, and it's all about AI. So Matthew, I wondered how you would tax the AI economy, given the difficulties of taxing individuals. Jane, is AI positive as far as, for example, elder care is concerned? Is there any sense in which it could substitute for, rather than simply enhance, human carers? And Tim, I totally agree with you about the deficit in European technological independence. What can we do about it?
Okay, another set of small questions. And we've got another question over here. Let's put together three, and then we'll take one last round, I think, probably.
Sorry. Yeah, it's not going to be another small question.
Next round.
You've touched on this in all your papers, and I think it is something that Adam Smith definitely discusses, is the tension between the global and the policy unit, which is the nation. And it relates to Simon's paper. So welfare, political economy is all decided in the nation state, and yet we've seen the advantages of global trade and Jane saying we can't do any care work in countries of declining demographics without international movement of caring labour. And yet we don't have of any kind, well, we have some, but they're not working very well, international bodies of political economy. The European Union was mentioned, and we see that's maybe the best we can, and there's problems with that. So if you have any comments on how do we deal with the advantages of globalism with a set of institutions that are based in the nation.
Right, 3 great questions. Who would like to take them one by one? Matthew, do you want to address the question about how we deal with some of the historically uglier aspects of the Adam Smith legacy, but also then repackage it to deal with, if you like, communicating it to the modern generation within the current cultural context?
Yeah. Thanks for giving me the controversial one.
Well, I thought you could take it. You're a double Bennett, so there you go.
Emeritus, I've still got to deliver a career. So,
and by the way, just while you're thinking about that, the cultural issues also hang over somebody like John Maynard Keynes, of course, because so much of his framework came out of a sense of extreme elitism and arrogance as well. And so reading that today, so it's true of many of the figures who've been so influential, as they come with a lot of cultural baggage. Okay, Matthew, I bought you time to think.
Yeah. I don't have a comprehensive answer for this. I don't think any individual likely does. I think that it is useful to read the texts of the foundations of any discipline as foundations of the discipline alone. It is also useful to read them in their broader social context and relate that social context to today. So an economist, you can't really call yourself an economist going through the academic system now if you've not read Smith. So I don't think we should be taking it out of the curriculum. I think we should be aware of the broader contexts. I think we should also be careful about how we operationalize that awareness. Right? Cutting things out of the curriculum doesn't solve a whole lot of problems. And we have, across many universities in the UK now, an active sort of process of soul searching about our relationships with, say, the slave trade. Those are useful things to have. It's also useful to be aware that there are more slaves today living in slavery now than were traded in the entirety of the slave trade. And that we should be pushing some activism there as well. So there's 27 million slaves, according to the UN today. Should I go to the AI and tax thing?
Sure.
This is where
Yeah.
So in the paper we have under review at the moment is a proof of concept, an idea. We want to stake out some thoughts and then hopefully pursue a more in-depth project later on. You asked where we might tax the AI economy. I can think of at least 3 potential options. One of them is we could tax the compute, the chips, the computing power, the physical tools for the AI economy. And we might be interested in doing that because we can identify where that computing power is. We know that there are 3 countries in the world that can produce the chips, so you can tax there, that's easy. But that doesn't help with redistribution around the world at all. So we could think about taxing compute at the point of deployment, where all the data centers are. We can find that pretty easily too. There's a great big glowing halo around every data center because we know the energy consumption there, so we can find that too. But again, it doesn't really get us to global distribution in any sort of way. We could think about taxing the raw input, which would be the data. We could tax flows of bits. But that's going to be devilishly difficult for a tax authority to actually identify and monitor and impose a tax. So I end up back in King's with the guru and think that, well, we know that these things have externalities. We know that there's a carbon implication of the energy. We know that there's a water implication of cooling the data centers. We know that there's a local energy price spike because the data centers take up so much energy that local energy prices rise. We can introduce Pigouvian taxes on all of these things. We have mechanisms for doing that. And so that's where I think it would be most straightforward.
That sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading the paper. By the way, another little cultural wrinkle is the roots of the word data. This will give you lots of things for your next Trivial Pursuit game. The roots of the word data, I don't know if anyone knows where that comes from. It's nothing to do with numbers. It comes from the Latin dare, meaning that which is given. And you give up your information in exchange for something, often these days free digital services, or supposedly free. Anyway, Jane.
Yes, can I talk to the first question first? But when I did the work on Adam Smith there's a volume of essays, and I actually counted the number of references in Adam Smith to women and to children because I was interested in them as workers. And Alex, who's editing this, showed this, my essay, because I then said Adam Smith had no intrinsic interest in women and children. And the editor's colleague said, oh, but when he says men, he actually means men and women. So I went back and looked at the references, and when Adam Smith said men, he definitely didn't mean men and women, he meant men. So, furthermore, there are some really peculiar references to women in Adam Smith that you have to understand, as you say, he was a man of his time. I mean, he proselytized about the nutritional merits of the potato at great length, and said this was why Irish navvies were so muscular and could, do more work than Englishmen. And he said, and also, look, the potato is very, it improves people's physical being. So Irish prostitutes are so beautiful. So if you're reading this today, it's astonishing. But you have to see him as a man of his time. And I'm with Matthew, and if you take it out of the curriculum, then it's much better to expose students to this and then to discuss some of these.
To be clear, I'm not advocating for taking
No,
out.
no,
but just like pedagogically,
yeah,
how?
Pedagogically, it's better to have the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. That yes.
And on the AI question, there is a chapter in the in the Review of the Economic Policy, the Oxford Review of it, that edition that I directed people towards on the use of AI in elder care. And it's true that it could substitute for some, perhaps, the less relational, the more mundane aspects of elder care, but it can't provide the relational connections that people value so much. And there is a danger, of course, that AI reduces the delivery of care to measurable units. And we use that to then talk about the productivity of care workers. So they're the two things that you really are struggling with when you think about how to introduce AI into the care sector, and particularly into elder care.
Tim.
Yeah, it's like amusement at the discussion around this. Not that there's not a super serious point, but I mean, the issue we face among economists and economics students is they read nothing that hasn't been published in the last 15 years. The idea they read Smith, I think that's for the birds. I mean, if they do a course in the history of economic thought, of course they have to read Smith. In fact, one of the great problems we have is that generations of economic students just don't read any history, don't read anything that was written until before, as I said, 15 years would be my benchmark. So
maybe
actually,
we need Smith, the TikTok version.
maybe, yeah, you're right.
And I'm only partly joking, actually. Instagram, TikTok. If I was in charge of celebrating the 250th anniversary right now, that is absolutely what I'd be doing, or trying to produce a manga version. And again, I'm not joking.
I think you have a point, because it used to be the case most economics departments put on sometimes a compulsory course in the history of economic thought. And that's all completely disappeared now. Partly because there's no one to teach them, because no one knows any history of economic thought. So you're right that there would be some serious consequences of them engaging with these texts, but at the moment I don't think there's too much danger that they would. In reality, be reading some of these things. On the technological falling behind, well, if you read the Draghi report, he came up with the number of investment of 800 billion in the European tech sector. But he was a little bit unclear as to what the mode of either raising that money or spending that money would be. But there is a follow-on group that's meeting. It's going to be called the Rhine Group, which to carry forward the Draghi agenda, as to know exactly what should Europe be doing to try and, if it's seriously concerned about its technological backwardness, what would be the mode. There's a number of tricky issues because it's not an issue for the EU, first of all, it's an issue for Europe, and I know the UK has just made this more complicated. But you know, there's Switzerland and there's Norway, so it wasn't just us who made it complicated. Even within the EU, there's huge tension about where technological investments would go. At the moment, the Baltics are racing ahead in some parts of technology, mainly funded by the Danes, as far as I go. So the Danish banks are funding investments in the Baltics. And some countries in Europe are very unhappy about that because they see that as, you know, you're going to have the tech industries all located there. Why aren't they being located in our country? So the EU is going to have to do an awful lot of hard work to start having a technology strategy that gets away from those sort of silly, but it's got to be here or it's got to be there. I mean, as far as I know, the US is places in the US do not complain yet. Maybe they already do. That, you know, it's all in Silicon Valley.
Oh, they do. You know, they definitely do.
Yeah, but they needed those agglomeration externalities to get the whole industry moving. Maybe they don't need them anymore. There's places like Arizona, I know, which are now becoming kind of outposts, partly because it's too expensive to live in Silicon Valley. On the taxing of AI, just one comment. I don't think there's. I think there's a lack of will here. And a good example was, remember there was a proposal to put transaction taxes on higher transactional taxes on digital products. And why didn't we do it? Why was that not even on the starting block? Because Trump immediately turned around and said you're going to have tariffs because you're effectively taxing US businesses. I mean, there's a huge amount of lack of will. I don't think it's just a technological problem. If you look at the history of taxation, when we've wanted to do it, we've figured out ways to do it. The problem at the moment is I don't see anyone really wants to do it. And it would be a good starting point to have some amount of resolve that we really need to address.
Yeah, Matthew, and I've got one comment to make on that myself, looking at the American scene.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the points we actually do bring up in the paper is the history of the digital services tax. And the fact that has been sort of pushed out by essentially the Trump administration, as you say. But the next line, essentially, in the paper is those sorts of unilateral vetoes of global tax, of efforts towards global tax cooperation are going to become more prominent, easier to deliver that veto as we concentrate wealth. Musk bought the White House for like $250 million. That's a really cheap way to buy out a huge government. Right?
Yeah, I would.
That kind of political influence is it's going to really affect the ability of countries to deliver tax reform.
I'd personally say I think you're half right. Musk tried to buy the White House for $250 million. However, there are three factions around Trump. One is the techno-oligarchs who've been in the ascendant, but another is the populists who are absolutely rising right now. And many of them are virulently anti-big tech and anti-AI, if you are immersed in that world. And they are becoming increasingly influential. So I'd say, the first chapter was Musk buying the White House. I'm not convinced the second chapter is going to be that way. And so I wouldn't rule out the idea of some kind of tax on AI coming back onto the agenda, personally.
He rented the White House.
Rented the White House. Yeah, well, I think that battle is still, being waged right now. Right, got a question back there, and then...
Just shout.
I think the microphone's coming round.
Thanks a lot. On these questions of AI, the future, and Adam Smith, should we talk more about competition and antitrust, right? Is one of the ways in which not being able to tax, having a clear sensation, certainly of large parts of the public, that the institutions aren't really holding against certain structures in the tax sector, And, throw in something like Philippe Arian's concern that we are not even getting the productivity that we should be getting from AI. Is the link there really good old-fashioned Smithian competition policy?
Yeah, or monopolies.
Or monopolies,
Lack of
right? Is this our 21st century East India Company moment?
I think that's a great question. The concentration is terrifying, not least because you suddenly discover all the data centers are sitting close to each other in the Gulf right now. But any more? There was another question, I think, over there. Yes.
Yep, okay, this thing works. Yes, it does. Great. I would like to ask a question about the good economics, or no good economics without good politics sort of principle, which I could not disagree with that. So far, so good. I would like to ask some questions about the kind of how do we actually implement some of that. Linking to what Matthew was talking about, sort of wealth accumulation and inclusive wealth, that's all kind of questions that has to do with a very long time horizon. If we want to reform the tax system and try to sort of bring into the tax bases that are very shiftable, that requires long-term investment in capacity to do that as well. So all of that is sort of about things that have a long time horizon. We know that democratic politics have a tendency for short-term biases. So my question is, how do we kind of get at that tension? What sort of things do we need to do? Is it about getting a better measurement system so we measure the right things, so that becomes what politicians start focusing on? Is it about creating a consensus, along the London consensus perhaps, amongst the political elite? Is it about communicating that ideas or those ideas to the public, to the voters, so they would take it up? Is it about thinking about giving up some of the, or putting some boundaries on what democratic elected politicians are allowed to do, along the lines of what we did with central banks, taking some things out of the democratic day-to-day political decision-making process and make these decisions under different constraints and different institutions? So I'm sort of curious what sort of thoughts you have about this, the package of issues.
So how do we deal with the messy problem of democracy? Another small question. Right, who would like to jump in?
If you'd like, I'll just...
Yes, Tim, I think that's for you since you're a professor of political science, as you told us.
I'm not going to give you a comprehensive answer, but let me give you a couple of examples. I think the way we manage globalization was to totally ignore the political consequences of economic policy. So if we've been thinking lockstep of how we would resolve many of the issues which are now emerged. Now, maybe we just didn't have the foresight to know what some of the dislocations would be, who would be hit in what ways. So we could maybe just say, well, we just misjudged it for that reason. But if we have similar things, like the AI revolution now in front of us, could we do that without not just thinking about the economic consequences? This is as economists, but thinking, well, if things play out this way, are we going to create particular pockets of discontent and unrest in these areas of our economy, particularly if there's geographical concentration of some of those effects? I mean, the area where I think this has been so poorly thought through is in the area of the green transition. People talk about the inconvenient truth. The inconvenient truth with people in favour of the green transition was to completely sweep aside all the distributional consequences of it. Because they worried that if they started talking about the distributional consequences, putting up people's electricity bills, putting certain people out of work, it would kill the thing they cared about, which was reducing carbon emissions. So instead of confronting it, they chose to ignore it. There is actually a very good report written by our Treasury in the UK on how to manage the distributional consequences. It's probably been taken off the web by now because these things tend to be. But it was written about what could we do to have a green transition, and that was very much because of, you may care about distribution intrinsically, it's perfectly reasonable to do that, but also a lot of the stuff, it's like, you squeeze the toothpaste tube, a lot of the consequences of distributional stuff show up in your politics. And so if you're not thinking about that, then I think you're making a huge mistake. The other area where I think we've crept into, which is related back again to net zero, is so we've really made it difficult for government to operate with net zero. It's not that we don't believe in it, but we've not thought through the consequences. And this is having very serious implications. It's almost certainly going to be one of the main forces that brings a reform government in this country into power, because we paralyse government. So let me give you an example. The government, on September the 28th, this government announced the policy it was going to have 5 new towns. If you didn't read carefully, you'd think that was what the policy was. The policy was not to have 5 new towns. It was to have an environmental assessment about the possibility of having 5 new towns, thereby basically just rolling out into the future whenever this would happen. The one that already had planning permission was cancelled. So there was a short list of actually 12 places, one of which was ready to go, had planning permission and everything. That was not selected. The 5 that were selected didn't have planning permission. They're now locked in judicial review. They will probably be locked in judicial review for as long as, I don't know, maybe for the duration of this government. And those are choices we have made in society, that we are willing to tolerate an incapacity of government to deliver the basic things we want to deliver. The case for these new towns is overwhelming. But until we've solved we've confronted every minor issue and everybody in every place that can possibly bring a judicial review, we won't let it happen. And that's, again, we haven't thought through the political consequences. So we're going to bring in lawbreakers. What the US elected? A lawbreaker. Because people got fed up with having people obeying the law, and they thought that was too constraining. Our next government's going to be a law-breaking government, because they're going to say, forget these judicial reviews, they don't count for anything. So we're just bringing it on ourselves by not thinking through the political consequences of the policy measures we have been bringing in. And net zero is a classic point. I was at the table when the net zero strategy was being developed, and nobody was thinking about these kinds of consequences of having a policy like that, and how it would mean we couldn't deliver. There's been no major road project delivered in the UK since we adopted net zero. And that's because every single one of them has been thrown out on judicial review. So I really think these are examples of how we've got to get wiser in the way we design and think through the implications of economic policies when we have them. I hope that those are decent examples. I don't know.
I couldn't agree more personally. I would say that after we had day 1 of the conference yesterday in the Keynes Hall, I then moderated a fireside chat with Greg Jackson, the CEO of Octopus, who said 2 remarkable things. One is that he's actually calling for the government to grant more licenses for natural gas expansion in the North Sea in light of the current crisis, and precisely because, although he more than anybody is chasing net zero goals, he realises we have to be political about it and make sure we don't punish the wider public and the economy. And secondly, the system for pricing energy in this country is beyond insane, and something as simple and obvious as dynamic pricing cannot be implemented within this current structure. So just to echo what you said, it was a really astonishing set of comments from him. Matthew.
I'd like to add a clarification to this on net zero. The reasons we're making net zero expensive and politically unpalatable are nothing to do with the price of the technologies, the engineering capacity, the ability of people to install the technology that we need. None of that. The reasons we're making it expensive is because we can't get the politics right. It's nothing to do with the economics or the technology or the science. It's all politics. It's policy decisions around the way that we price energy in this country. So I just don't want to lose sight of the engineering and the science bit there. We had questions on AI and competition. I think, AI is going to require an awful lot of innovation in competition policy. The 2 people I would want properly to try and answer that would be Flavio Toxverd and Diane Coyle. And I'm afraid I can't give a good answer for it, but they're the ones I would want to. I mentioned in sort of a throwaway comment, we have these constant returns to scale government and an increasing returns to scale sector. The difference in capacity and understanding and knowledge, the asymmetry of information between a small number of individuals and a small number of firms and any government anywhere in the world when it comes to AI technologies and where they can generate value is absolutely astounding. And I think that information asymmetry, governments just don't understand it. Our politicians don't understand it. I don't understand That's going to make it very, very difficult to regulate. That's going to be a challenge for us. We had a question on global tax policy and coordination and cooperation. We did actually have, against every belief that I had, we had a huge amount of very positive momentum on what's called Pillar 2 of the OECD tax reform. So introducing a global minimum corporation tax so that companies couldn't have operations in this country but book their profits in that country because the taxes were low. And they introduced a 15% minimum corporation tax on companies with over 750 million, I think, euros in revenue a year. That was set to be implemented over the past sort of 12 to 18 months when it started to come in. But we also saw the Trump administration come in. So for the OECD to get all these countries on board and signed up for it, including Guernsey, Jersey, Malta, BVI, Bermuda, all of them except Cayman. Cayman said no. To get them all to come in and say, yes, we're going to sign up to this was an incredible, unbelievable, I didn't believe it, piece of progress. But
Almost. Yes. Well, maybe next time. At least there's been a bit of an icebreaker there, but yes. Jane.
Yes, on green transition and managing decline of industries like mining. I'm too from South Yorkshire. I didn't know you were from South Yorkshire. And I've seen my village, where I grew up, go from being filthy but prosperous to being one of the most deprived parts of the modern UK, and also voting regularly for reform. So it's an illustration of exactly what Tim was saying about politics and the economics generating
Right.
action together. But I do think that it's very difficult to manage green transition in this managed decline, because many of the consequences of the closure of pits were unforeseen. I mean, it's the kind of thing that historians are actually really good at. There are unintended consequences, that historians are good at thinking about. And we do have lots of studies of mining communities and what happened to them, and we might be able to learn from those kinds of qualitative studies. On the tax issue and contributions, I like this word, contributions here. It reminds me of something Amartya Sen wrote about years and years ago in one of his papers, where there was I don't know whether it was the Great Bengal famine or some famine where the states were voluntarily asked if they would donate money from individual citizens and collect money. And this went on, and it was the drive was going well, and then they published the results, and it turned out that the richest state had given the least, and the poorest state had given the most. And so says, that after that, the whole thing collapsed, because people in the poorest areas were angry. And I think this suggests what we really need to be very clear about is transparency of burdens and benefits. And this is why, allegedly, the person on the Clapham omnibus thinks that migrant workers are a burden on the welfare state.
Right. Well, again, that's a very good point because it illustrates the challenge. We've got about literally 2 minutes left. Do you want to make literally 30 seconds max?
Okay.
Briefly.
Well, it's just my answer to my own question.
Okay, you can tell us your word game in 30 seconds.
By the way, I didn't say who I was. Simon Schretter, Professor of History and Public Policy.
I think we all know, yes.
I think I'm very much in line with Jane on this. You'll be very pleased to hear that I think point number one is we need to have a transparent system of income, and we have Sweden, Norway, Finland, which already insist every citizen has to transparently declare their income, and that is accessible public knowledge. They're not exactly the world's least successful economies and societies, are they? So transparency would be crucial. And then my preferred word, and think about this, just as the headline word on the tax form you receive, and then all the other stuff underneath, what you're going to love is care. It should just be called care. Tax should be called care. And then, everything else, and your contributions to care, and companies that don't want to pay it, well, they don't care, do they?
I think that's absolutely brilliant. And it's a brilliant note on which to end, because I can imagine that Adam Smith, were he grappling with AI and climate change and polarization and ugly international conflicts, would probably love the idea of going back to basics and talking about the word at the heart of trust, which indeed is care. Caring for each other, caring for the environment, caring for well-being and the future of the economy in a wider sense. So on that note, I'm going to say a very big thank you to the panellists for a terrific discussion. A huge thank you to all of you who've taken part in the discussions in the last couple of days, which really has shown the ability of Cambridge to host interdisciplinary conversations which are provocative, challenging, and also incredibly vital and relevant to where we are today. Once again, can we thank both our sponsors, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and King's, and Gareth and the others who organised this. And I just say, last of all, as we've heard all these amazing ideas and areas of future research, good luck in putting them into practice. Thank you.